Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Jack Despain Zhou. Jack, welcome to the show.
Thanks, great to be here.
So, you have founded a new group that I find really interesting that is called the Center for Educational Progress. And essentially, the idea behind CEP, as you kind of put it in the founding post or the founding letter on your website, the idea is that schools should pursue excellence. And that seems like, I guess, uncontroversial to me. Like, why would anyone ever want to be against excellence? But there's a story that you seem to be telling about excellence versus equity as two goals that have been pursued at various times by the education system. So can you kind of walk me through what you mean by this framing of the educational world as people who are pursuing excellence versus people who are pursuing equity?
Yeah, I can. And one way, there are many ways that I can start it, but one way I like to start it is by giving an example of what learning about education law and policy has looked like for me as a law school student. At law school, the one class that I could take related to education law was an equity and bias in education class, talking about basically how to achieve equity in education. And one assignment from that stuck out, one group project. They had us look at charter school, or excuse me, not charter school law. They had us look at the law around admission to selective schools in Pennsylvania. So these schools that are designed to be academic magnet schools, bring in students from around the city to the city of Philadelphia to study in more intensive environments, and asked, how can admissions to these schools be made more equitable? Now, as soon as you ask a question like that, as soon as you set a goal like that, you have set the answers to that question. So as soon as your goal is make this more equitable, for example, when you look at something like a selective school is inherently by its concept, because you're immediately separating people out into, people who can make it into the school, people who can't. It's inherently inequitable. And so usually the answers of how to make it more equitable look like things that distort the purpose of the school. So they start adding lottery admissions, for example. They start fuzzing the selective metrics. They start recommending get rid of standardized tests, things like that. Essentially, as soon as you set a goal, you know what is going to happen with it. And what has happened in the education system for a long time when you're looking at education policy around things like advanced classes, around things like selective schools, around things, anytime you have something that is looking at how can we push the ceiling upward, the question that most policy reformers and most policy-oriented people have had is, how can we make this more equitable? And that has systematically, I would argue, distorted the focus on a lot of things that work. So, for example, in the 1980s, you had a big dispute around ability grouping. You had the book Keeping Track by Jeannie Oakes that made a qualitative argument, looked at some schools that had pretty poor lower tracks, and said essentially the very idea of separating students into higher and lower classes was inequitable. You had a lot of research on it, and different meta-analyses looked at different things. You had, for example, Robert Slavin ran a meta-analysis where he looked at classes that didn't change the curriculum, but just separated students into these groups, and found that ones that did that didn't really have any academic effect. And he said, this didn't really have any academic effect, and because we value, this egalitarian ideal, this ideal of equity, then because it doesn't really have any effect on any of these groups, we should avoid ability grouping. You had another meta-analysis by Chen Lin and James Kulik, who were more focused on this excellence lens, and they said, look, he was only looking at these classes that don't change curriculum at all. As soon as you start changing the curriculum, as soon as you have, for example, gifted programs, things like that, they raise achievement on the top end, and they don't harm achievement, and they don't harm any other metrics that we can tell on other ends. Therefore, because our goal is to raise achievement overall, we should have programs like this. And those sort of set the terms of the debate. But the great majority of the policy people on this topic tended to be in one camp, in the camp of we want to level down, even if we can raise achievement at the top end, that's not actually a priority. That's not something we want to do. Um, and so they started pushing, for example, detracking in schools. So getting rid of top-level math classes, getting rid of gifted programs, things like that. And that's been a lot of where the battle in that area has been. So what the Center for Educational Progress is trying to do is lay out, essentially, we understand and have understood for a long while the things that work to raise achievement and the things that work to raise achievement at all levels in education. However, because people surprisingly haven't really people have been so focused on the concept of closing gaps versus raising overall achievement that anything that raises achievement at the top end, and any effective intervention is going to raise achievement at the top end and at the bottom end in general. Anything that raises achievement at the top end is deprioritized, which means that we have a lot of effective interventions that we know about that could raise achievement really at all levels, that could make education more effective at all levels, but they've been systematically deprioritized because they raise achievement at all levels instead of being targeted towards closing gaps.
Now, this is something I'm a little suspicious of. Not because it's like something that I don't want to believe. I'm a little bit suspicious of it because it almost sounds too good to my ears, if that makes sense. Like, this is a story about a bunch of like kind of lefty academics who went all in on this idea of equity. And they're the reason that our nation's schools aren't performing the way that they should. And all we've got to do is go back to this, true and simple idea of excellence. And I know that like that's something I would be predisposed to believe very strongly. So I'm almost like guarding myself against buying into it immediately. I know who my punching bag is sometimes. I'm a guy who likes to punch left. This is an ideological podcast. It's fine. I like to make fun of the left when they have silly ideas about DEI or whatever. But so I want to guard myself here and make sure that I'm not just automatically agreeing with this, because it sounds like the kind of thing I would agree with. How much is this actually playing out in like real day-to-day stuff? Because like I have family members who are still in school and family members who have children in school and then gifted classes. And maybe there are like some cities and a couple places in San Francisco where, they talk about getting algebra out of a certain grade and you have to wait longer because they don't want it to be like, I don't know, unfair, or one group of kids shouldn't be able to take it in eighth grade and the other group has to wait until 10th grade or 11th grade or whatever the case. I'm sure that happens in a couple places like San Francisco, but is that really a widespread problem? I guess I would ask, is this something that all around the country is really genuinely impacting the educational environment? Or is this something that is like isolated to just a couple like very deep blue cities?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And to answer that, one way that I want to answer that is to go back to history a little bit and look at essentially try to prime your intuition a little bit on this, because you're right, it is too easy, too pat to make this a story about all these, lefty academics, whatever. And I don't want to make it a story about that, because it's not just lefty academics, it is everyone who has touched education for a long period of time has essentially not wanted to touch the idea that kids learn at different rates and that some kids are going to learn faster, some kids are going to learn slower, and you are not going to have a single fixed rate for all students. The entire education system for a very long while has been set up around this notion that there is something that is grade level progress, that there is something that once a kid reaches a certain age, they should learn this certain set of things. And if they are not learning this certain set of things, that is a problem. If they are learning more than this certain set of things, okay, cool, fantastic, we don't care much about that. But this has been so non-controversial and so undisputed in the education world that, for example, when education became a huge issue in politics, when it became the center of national politics, and when Republicans and Democrats united to do that thing that we all love, bipartisan legislation. They said, we have a great idea. We are going to fix education once and for all. And the goal we are all united around is we are going to close education gaps. And we are going to close education gaps by mixing the two hands of like the policies that these left-leaning people are pushing, the policies that these right-leaning people are pushing. We're going to have these accountability measures for low-performing schools, and we're going to pair it with this sort of support and this sort of thing. And by 12 years from now, all schools will have children able to read and write and do math at the same level. And that was No Child Left Behind in 2001. And as we all know, after 2001, 12 years later, all schools progressed up to the same level. All the gaps were closed, all of their targets were met, and by 2013 to 2014, just like they promised, every child in America was able to read, write, and do math at the same level. Except, of course, none of that happened, and at the time the bill was signed, anyone serious, anyone focused on the problem could have known that none of that would have happened, that closing gaps was in that way was not actually going to happen, was not actually feasible, was not actually the way any of that works, because, again, kids learn at different rates. But because they set this target, this universal, schools are all going to reach the same target thing, it's the sort of thing that policy has run at again and again and again, and set these big ambitious promises of we're going to close all the gaps, all the kids are going to learn at the same rate, and optimize towards something impossible rather than optimizing towards raising the achievement of all kids. And again, it's failed. And No Child Left Behind was particularly pernicious and unfortunate in this. And this is where, I, again, pushing back on the idea that it's just lefty academics doing something, because you had this idea that if a school is struggling, it's the fault of the people in it. It's the fault of the teachers. It's the fault of the principal. It's the fault of everyone. What you had is teachers and principals going into the areas that needed the most help and the areas that were the most demanding. And you told them time and time again, as they are working with unusually challenging problems, telling them, sorry, you guys are failing. You guys suck. You guys suck so bad that we're going to strip all your funding, and we're going to talk all the time about how much you suck, and we're going to make this a miserable environment for every teacher and every principal and every person who wants to be in this, because dang it, this is accountability, and this is what's going to work to drive these things up.
Let me ask a question about this idea of closing the gap. Because to my ears, not being deeply enmeshed in like education, research, or anything, but just thinking about what I value in society, that seems like a reasonable goal. Like I would also agree with your goal that we should have as many students pursuing excellence as possible. And if we can raise the boat for everybody at the same time, like even if there's a gap, still, then that's good. I would rather there be a gap and everybody be at a higher level than stay at the same level. But at the same time, if you can do both, it seems to me like you should do both. Like closing the gap is not something that in the abstract is a bad thing, right? And it should be a goal if we're able to do it. And, if I'm giving the maximum amount of charity to like education reformers going back decades or whatever, thinking back to the 60s or 70s or whenever, I think there were probably a lot of circumstances where, for instance, in directly Black neighborhoods and cities, the schools were just horrible, probably, like, and the kids legitimately got very little funding compared to other schools, and maybe the teachers weren't as good, decades ago. And I can see people saying, yeah, kids in this historically disadvantaged, really poor neighborhood or minority neighborhood, they're getting much lower scores, but if we actually treated them fairly, they would get those up, or that gap would close. To somebody looking from that lens, I can see why that's a reasonable thing they would think, and why that would be a goal that they had at that time when, we were just barely finished desegregating schools or whatever. So I guess, do you think there's something there? Do you think that in your mind, is that closing a gap also something we should pursue on top of excellence? Or is that kind of talk in your mind just dangerous and bad, and we should not be aiming at it?
Yeah. So that's a fantastic, important question that really gets to the heart of a lot of things. And I'll start with a quote from the Les Mis musical. Everyone's equal when they're dead. That is, it is very, very easy to close all academic performance gaps. you just don't teach anyone anything at any point. Everyone stays at 0. All gaps are closed. Equalizing academic performance is ultimately among all kids, equalizing academic performance among all kids, among adults, among anyone learning anything is going to be something of a fool's errand, in that as soon as you are teaching people anything, teaching Freddie DeBoer, a very thoughtful leftist writer on education, writes a lot about this, essentially, that education is fundamentally not, as people sort of picture it, a tool of creating equality. Education is fundamentally a tool of creating inequality, because it is a tool of creating skill. And as soon as you are creating skill, as soon as you're creating any sort of progression, you are creating skill gaps. That said, there are a lot of gaps that it is important to close, and a lot of places where I think things are sympathetic. So, for example, I think you're absolutely right that in the 60s and 70s, as reformers were looking at, for example, segregated schools, things like that, and saying this sort of thing absolutely can't stand, they were right. They saw and reacted to the problems of their time and said, it is absurd that we are treating children unequally in this way, that every kid deserves an opportunity to learn, every kid deserves to be taken seriously, every kid deserves resources, every kid deserves funding, things like that. And I think that things like closing funding gaps and so forth are admirable and have been done to a great extent. In fact, the great majority of education funding now goes to, at the federal level, at the state level, goes to disadvantaged kids versus privileged ones. It goes to,
And I would say partially that's just because the local model of funding is set up such that rich areas and rich schools are often funded locally, right? With like a property tax or whatever. And so rich areas can afford more funding because they're richer. And so federal and state often steps in to try to close that gap. Is like that's the
yes.
general lay of the land, right?
Yeah. So that's the general lay of the land. But you'll see it also in, for example, look at gifted education versus special education. Off the top of your head, like what percent of, say, the federal education budget would you guess is devoted to gifted education?
Oh, my guess would be very low. I would say 2 to 3%, maybe.
0.02%. That is, there is one program, one like $15 million program tossed out that's basically just like, find a few research opportunities and such, think about this. And that's it. That's all the federal funding that has ever been allocated to gifted education, the Jacob Javits gifted program. That's it. That's the only part. Whereas, of course, special education understandably takes up a much, much larger share of the federal budget. So yeah, absolutely, there's this local federal model, but there's also this question of values. And in terms of what we value educationally, we've elected at a funding level that special education versus gifted education is something that we value special education much, much higher at a funding level. Things like that. Anyway, so that's all part of the thing. But I do think that in general, funding people from disadvantaged backgrounds is appropriate. Funding people who are struggling is appropriate. Having these high levels of funding like that sort of thing is appropriate. Another thing where I think it's appropriate to close the gap, if you consider geographical inequality, like which areas have schools that can effectively serve the student populations, which areas don't. You'll have even things like rural-urban divides where, in a rural area, you might just have less access to a lot of the things that matter than in an urban area. Urban areas, just by higher population clusters, are more likely to be able to have specialized magnet schools, for example, for students who are highly talented, things like that. Gaps like that are really important to close. And another gap that I think is very important in terms of thinking about closing the gap is the sort of invisible gap that always sits in any discussion of education, which is the public-private gap. That is, it is absolutely appropriate in a country that prioritizes free education to say students in free schools should have every bit the educational opportunity that students in expensive private schools have. And that if we are not serving students in free schools the same level of like academic rigor and academic seriousness and academic effort that private schools have, then that is a problem. So all of these are gaps that genuinely should be closed. However, none of these will ultimately lead to closing between all individual children the academic performance gap, where all 9-year-olds will perform math at a quote-unquote third grade level. And that's the same reason that all 9-year-olds don't perform soccer at a third grade level, and don't perform chess at a third grade level, and don't perform piano at a third grade level, which is that different people progress in different skills at different rates. and different people have different interests in those skills. One way or another, as soon as you start instructing people in those skills, gaps will emerge. And more than trying to teach everyone at the same rate, what is important is testing where people are at and then teaching them what they're ready to learn and giving them opportunity to progress seriously so that they can.
So, what is your vision of the good? What is that going to look like here? You're starting out with a thesis statement, right? That we've been overly concerned with equity for too long, both in terms of what our academics are pushing for and what administrators are pushing for and what the federal government is using its funding and its money to do via the Department of Education. And that whole system broadly has been like really, really concerned with equity to the detriment of this other thing that you think we should care about, which is excellence. And that seems to be the thesis. And like I said, I'm very sympathetic to that idea, and I'm very sympathetic to tracking. And like a lot of people, it makes me mad when I hear about like San Francisco or somewhere trying to cancel gifted classes or cancel early level algebra. But just beyond a few things. But so you've set up this new think tank, this institute or whatever you want to call it. And I'm sure you guys will be involved in like the stupid San Francisco fights where you wag your finger at San Francisco and say like, don't do that. That's a bad thing. And, maybe there will be similar fights in a couple other deep blue cities. But I would be interested to hear, what is your vision of like a better education system overall? Like, what would it look like if we don't have targets? If there's not a universal target for like by the fourth grade, all students should be able to do this amount of math, or this is fourth grade math, or this style of math. They should know this particular set of things about science, and they should be able to read at this particular level. If we're not doing that, if we don't have those targets, then what are we doing? What is your vision for the better education system?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And to touch on the negative side of it a bit first, right? The defensive fights. I think it is important to recognize that right now something like this is very much on the back foot, and the great majority of policy proposals have been, to my mind, regressions versus defending the status quo. And so you have things like the fight to get eighth grade algebra back in San Francisco. And note, even there, it's not like a fight to ensure that students who are prepared for algebra early can take algebra early. It's just a fight to ensure that any students who are ready for it in eighth grade can take it at all. And then fights in like
And that is the case, right? That's the case in a place like New York.
not even just deep blue cities, right? Northern Virginia, Philadelphia, some of these places have selective schools that they are trying to weaken the selection criteria for trying to essentially misunderstanding the purposes of selective school in the first place. And to pause to explain that, the purpose of academically selective schools is that if you have people who are far away from median performance in something, if you gather more of them together, then you can provide opportunities that wouldn't necessarily be useful to the median student, but might be extraordinarily useful to outlier students. So for example, you're not going to have a group of 30 students looking to take linear algebra in high school in a normal high school. In a more concentrated high school and a more selective, academically selective one, you will have things like that.
And this is actually something that is a not come up very much in the New York City mayor's race, because Zohran Mamdani has so many bizarre issues. It actually hasn't come up very much because like he's all talking about the $30 minimum wage and the free buses and defund the police and free grocery stores, government run grocery stores, I should say. Those things like dominated the New York City mayor's race. But in addition to that, Zohran has also kind of endorsed basically changing the selection criteria for New York. I think New York has like 7 top public schools. It's like Stuyvesant and a bunch of these like really selective schools. And that's something that's happening in New York right now. And it seems like you would obviously be on the other side.
Yes.
You would be protesting that like, no, the really rigorous academic schools in New York should maintain what is essentially kind of a system of elitism, I guess. But in the sense that like this elitism is good. We should have the best students taking really advanced courses, you know. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I would say this sort of, you can almost say this egalitarian sort of elitism in the sense of it is a very good thing. It is something that we should be proud of, that we have free schools that are as academically rigorous as the most selective private schools, that we have free schools that are, publicly run, state run, set up by the progressives of the past, in fact, to say we value educating, children who are from immigrant backgrounds, who are from poorer backgrounds, providing them really intense, academically rigorous opportunities that won't be appropriate for every student, but will be appropriate for some subset of students who are serious about this sort of thing. And having an egalitarian criterion for entry, which is a single test score, things like that. All of that is fundamentally a good thing. And the goal of it isn't this sort of like, this person is better than this person, sort of that. It is a sense of this student needs specific targeted academic interventions and will benefit from an environment that can gather a group of that sort of students together and provide interventions that wouldn't be possible in a less selected area. So you have fights like that. You have fights like defending these selective schools. You have fights like defending test scores as useful admissions criteria and as useful criteria in general, defending gifted programs, defending advanced programs. And then these fights aren't just in deep blue cities. They're going to be more or less the default in most places that have essentially like education schools as a whole and general progressive education advocacy organizations. This sort of thing is the entire lens they look through. The stuff I'm talking about doesn't even touch the radar for them. So anything that's like influenced by education schools, progressive advocacy organizations is going to do that. And then you don't really have this large organized force on the right suggesting the sort of things that I'm looking for and pushing for that sort of thing. Because the right position is generally dominated by school choice. So you have on the one hand people pushing towards this equity in one direction, and then on the other hand people saying, well, these schools are kind of failing, let's get them out of these public schools and let the free market figure it out. And I don't have a problem with the school choice movement in general. I think that it is healthy to allow market incentives to come in. I do think someone needs to make the market efficient. Anyway, so there's that environment, there are those defensive fights. But the important question you asked is, what does the positive vision look like? The basic answer is test what kids know, teach them where they're at. Test what kids know and teach them where they're at is such a basic, simple, for me, it's this baseline proposition for schools to be serious about educating their students. And it's something a vanishing tiny minority of schools in the country do. I can give some examples of schools that do it and have great success with it. There is Telra Institute in North Carolina, a recent charter school, does really effective, thoughtful, subject-specific ability grouping in mathematics and in reading. As soon as students come into the school, it tests their performance level and then places them in math and reading classes, not according to, their age, but according to what they actually know. And typically, most of their students progress far above grade level at that point. Then you have Alpha School in Texas. And full disclosure, the guys who fund Alpha School also fund our think tank, and we're very grateful for that. But one reason I'm grateful for it is because behind their flashy marketing and behind their glitzy numbers that they show up, there's something actually serious and fascinating going on, which is that they take 2 hours of their day and teach the core academic curriculum that other schools have in ways that their student regularly testing their students on what are called MAP tests, which are standardized tests that are designed to measure performance in this academic curriculum standardized across the entire country. And in that 2-hour span with their students progress more than twice as quickly as students in regular schools in a 6-hour time span on those same tests, on those same scores. So in this 2-hour time span, they're learning academic metrics by any measure much more efficiently, much more effectively than others. And then in the other 4 hours of the day, they look around and say, well, what is something interesting we can do with our school? So one of them is like the GT school, which is like, we're just going to go into more intense academics. One of them is more sports oriented. One of them is more like they have this like video game oriented one where it's like, gamers go like learn to design video games, learn to do these other things with this extra 4 hours. Because again, when you are progressing twice as quickly as a regular school in that time span, you can do that sort of thing. And another interesting one is Oakland Learn, a micro school in California, that doesn't have too many students, but has what looks like on the surface this very hippy-dippy model that like kids can come in when they want, come out when they want, can take classes whenever they want, can do things, but they provide this sort of individualized, focused instruction using effective curriculum principles that winds up, again, helping their students progress much, much faster than in a one-size-fits-all environment. And anytime their students are sitting down to learn something, they're sitting down to learn it using the most effective methods, the most effective ways. And schools like this, schools kicking around the fringes of the system, for me, really ignite the sense of what is possible. So when I'm looking towards a positive vision, I rely on schools like that and curricular tools like art of problem solving, which is an incredible mathematics curriculum that's used by basically every participant in the International Mathematics Olympiad from America. Places like that, I think, really point me towards a positive vision.
One of the reasons that it strikes me that people would be skeptical of this or afraid of this, maybe, I don't know, they would have ideological concerns about equity or whatever, but more a personal, on a parental level, I think that nobody really wants to hear that like their kid is being left behind. And like certainly, I don't know, I don't know how prevalent this would be because normally when schools try to take away gifted classes or like, eliminate algebra or whatever the case may be, there's normally pretty strong pushback from parents. It tends to be pretty unpopular. And it's something that's like pushed through by these school boards that, it's not in a sense the most democratic thing because my sense of it is that if you put it up for a vote, like tracking always wins if it actually gets a vote. Um, but I would imagine there are some parents who look at the kind of system you're talking about and they worry that like, well, this just means the standard is going to be lowered for my kid. Like, before you said you were going to have him reading at a fourth grade level in the fourth grade, and now all his friends are zooming past him and he's still stuck, like reading really simple stuff. And like, I don't know, do you think this is something like if somebody expressed this to you, how would you respond to that? Because I think that is a fear that many people would have. They don't want like their kid, right, to be the one who gets left behind in like a deeply tracked system.
Yeah, that's a good question. The first way that I'll answer that is by pointing out, I think it's important to keep in mind the reality of the current environment we are operating in, which is not that the sort of things I'm proposing are a large organized force with a lot of attention and a lot of focus, and there's a big brawl between this sort of thing and the sort of detracking movement, whatever. The system that we are operating in is instead, there's a very large, very organized movement around proposing these policies that tend to be extremely unpopular and tend to be opposed. And to put in perspective just how unpopular they are, David Shore, who does fantastic research, his organization Blue Rose Research does great things looking at basically how to get the Democratic Party elected. It has tested performance of different Democratic Party policies. The single least popular policy it has ever polled, the least popular policy, less popular than reparations, less popular than defund the police, is get rid of advanced classes in schools. Parents really, really, really hate getting rid of advanced classes in schools. And right now, there is an organized, large, serious coalition that will keep putting forward ideas like get rid of advanced classes in schools. And there really isn't anyone saying, actually, advanced classes are a good thing until you have like a need to. You have like small local organizations popping up and saying, hold on, actually, we like that. You have grassroots parental organizations kicking around and saying, we need a ballot petition for this. We need to do this. I was talking to the woman who ran the ballot proposition in San Francisco to get 8th grade algebra stuff on the ballot. And she was like, this was by far, in deep blue San Francisco, she was like, this is by far the most popular ballot proposition I have ever done anything for. Like, this was just extraordinarily, overwhelmingly popular. It won like 80% of the vote in San Francisco. So what you have right now is essentially a disorganized, decentralized cluster of people pushing something that is extremely, extremely popular with the public versus an organized, larger coalition pushing something that is extremely unpopular. Now, in terms of...
Let me break in there for just a second. Let me break in because it actually raises a question in terms of just like how your organization will operate. Because all this is happening at like a district by district level, right? This is not really the case that the federal government has set down rules that like necessarily that like every district in the country has to detrack as fast as they can. This is just like individual districts doing dumb things independently of one another. And they're all kind of influenced by the zeitgeist, right? But it makes me think that if you're gonna fight something in Milwaukee public schools, you probably need, like, a local Milwaukee group to do it, right? And if you're gonna fight something in San Antonio, you need a San Antonio group, and so on. So, how do you see your organization, the Center for Educational Progress, how do you guys fit in terms of helping win those fights?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you can take an example from current education and previous education policy fights. So, for example, in my least favorite fight in education, the book banning fight. Um, and I don't want to sidetrack everyone down a whole track. I'll just basically quickly say that I don't like that fight because I think that whether kids have 6 specific books in the library or not is mostly a symbolic fight that won't actually impact any kid's education or any kid's cultural experience given the ubiquity of the internet and smartphones. It's essentially a purely symbolic fight that people in both coalitions have really grasped onto as this thing that feels really momentous, feels really important, whatever, that to my eyes just distracts from the things that matter in education, the idea of, helping people perform. Anyway, so that aside, it provides a model of how this education policy stuff works, where those fights, again, are local fights. They're local battles. They're local organizations pushing things. But you have centralized national movements who are raising the salience of the issue, pointing to specific instances, keeping track of here's where this is happening, here's where this is happening, here's where this is happening, providing coordinating ideas, providing points of here's how you can organize about this, here's how you can do about this. If you're experiencing this in your local area, here's what to do. And that's the sort of role that I see the Center for Educational Progress playing, where you have this centralizing, coordinating force saying, here's what's going on. Here are the things that we care about. Here are the specific local levers that seem urgent to pull. Here are the specific local battles that are important. Here are ways to organize for it. Here are either this local group that we think is doing good things here, or we will organize a local group here to take this on. And essentially just looking at levers at the district level, at the state level, at the national level, the few levers that exist at the national level, and saying, we will work to pull any of these levers that we can. So that's basically what we envision it, how we envision it going, is this sort of national coordination and basically getting people on the same page about what needs to happen, after which point it's much easier to fight any specific individual battle at the state or district level.
So I had interrupted you, and you were kind of actually getting around to like, how would you talk to a parent who's nervous their kid will be left behind? And maybe the answer is there's not very many of those parents.
Yes.
Maybe it's an 80-20 issue, and we side with the 80, and we're like, don't worry about everyone else. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know.
Yeah, so I don't actually think that's the answer. I think that the answer is, and this isn't necessarily something that it remains to be seen how, politically effective this sort of messaging is, because this is not the sort of thing that has really been talked about. But if you're telling someone, look, if your child is actually reading at a second grade level, do you want your child to be receiving instruction that is constantly going over their head, that they are constantly struggling, that they feel like the slowest student in the class, the worst student in the class, that they feel like they are constantly having this low academic esteem because they think, I'm just stupid, I suck, I struggle, everything sucks. When I go to school, I don't learn and it sucks. Or do you want the student to be learning material tailored to their actual level that helps them progress and that helps them make meaningful progress? That is, do you want your student to progress from the 3rd grade to the 4th grade to the 5th grade to the 6th grade, not knowing how to read? Or do you want your student to progress from the 3rd grade to the 4th grade to the 5th grade to the 6th grade with reading classes that are tailored to their reading level of whatever their reading level happens to be, such that they are making consistent, real progress in reading, and that by the end, their actual performance and their actual understanding is much higher than it would be if they were rushed from level to level? And I don't know necessarily how how effective that is to sell people politically on. But morally, I think it is clearly right to teach people to their level versus teaching them to the level of the arbitrary average kid their age and then asking them to struggle to keep up and telling them they're stupid when they can't.
Are you concerned that in practice this might not work? Because there's a couple schools that do something like this, right? And it's, scattered around a couple locations. But, I think about this and I think about like really large scale implementation and like the idea that, if some kids are getting moved up and some kids are getting moved down, that, you might have like 15-year-olds who are, behind schedule in the same class as like 8-year-olds who are very ahead of schedule and they're kind of meeting in the middle. And, that's just how it might be because there are some 15-year-olds who are very behind and they really need help. And I wonder, like, does that work? Is that going to be dispiriting to the 15-year-olds? And are they going to rebel at having to sit in a class with somebody that they could like throw out of a window? Are the 8-year-olds benefiting? Like think like your brightest 8-year-olds are now sitting in a room full of teenage troublemakers because the teenage troublemakers are 2 grades below, and the best 8-year-olds are like 3 grades above, and like in practice, that seems like there would be like practical roadblocks to that kind of vision. And like you said, right now you're mostly just defending the idea that gifted classes work among students the same age. And the more radical vision seems like at the very least it would require a lot of experimentation in terms of how you actually make that work.
Yeah. So it would and it wouldn't. This is one thing that actually is an interesting coda to the fights over tracking that I was mentioning. So the meta-analysis that is most frequently cited as this shows that ability grouping doesn't work, which was Robert Slavin's that again worked with if grouping is not basically if it's grouping without selective curriculum, then it doesn't really do anything. You have to have curriculum tailored to the pace of what students actually need. Anyway, one thing that he did find in that, and that he ended up devoting a lot of his career to, was that subject-specific ability grouping in reading worked. And so he created a program called Success for All that was focused on subject-specific ability grouping in reading. He's implemented it in a lot of schools. It's, in fact, one of the most wide-scale examples of subject-specific ability grouping in practice. And it's consistently been cited as one of the educational interventions that has been genuinely more or less reasonably effective in the places that it is implemented. So that's one example of this isn't just a theoretical thing. This is something that fairly egalitarian-minded people looking at it turn to it and are like, well, actually, this is effective. This subject-specific grouping does work.
And those kind of experiments that have been done, those classes that have been held, like that includes wide-ranging age gaps, like 10-year-olds in the same class as 15-year-olds?
So it includes, I don't know how wide the age gaps are in the Success for All classes specifically. My understanding is that it's like, say, within an elementary school, you might have 4th and 6th graders in the same classroom type of thing. In general, even at my like most radical minded proposals, right? And I can get pretty radical with it. I can get pretty extreme with it because I really do think it matters to teach students where they're at. I would say that by the time you're getting more than about 2 or 3 grade levels, 2 or 3 years away from your peers, by the time you're, say, outpacing everyone around you by 2 or 3 years, that's really the time where it's time to look for a different environment. So a student like this really precocious 8-year-old who is leaps and bounds ahead of their peers on everything, that's the time, that's the reason that selective schools start becoming pretty important, because you want people. First of all, it's unhealthy for a kid to be the smartest kid in the room in every room that they're in. It teaches them bad habits to think that. Yeah, it really does teach them bad habits. This idea that they can coast, that they're brilliant, that they can just get by on intelligence, whatever. Because every specific skill that they need to build still does take a lot of really earnest, focused time and work. And if they just get used to coasting, and if they get used to like having this sort of intellectual arrogance of I can go into every room and I know everything, that's a genuinely unhealthy environment for them. So you want them to be in an environment around.
This is actually like This is interesting because it's a problem I think about sometimes. Like, one of the things that I've been noodling over recently is the innate talent versus hard work and perseverance kind of thing. Like, you need both in the long run if you want to accomplish big things. But I think about this kind of gifted kid trap as you're describing that are like a lot of gifted kids are always being told that they're so smart and they're always the best and like they've always got the answer for the teacher. And then as soon as they run into something hard, a lot of them end up like shutting down and they haven't actually been taught how to put in the hard work and how to struggle through something that's difficult. And maybe that's a result of like having had it too easy in classes that are way below
I
their
think it
ability
is.
level. And so they just think everything is easy.
I think it
Yeah.
really is downstream of that. I think that one strong benefit of testing where students are and then teaching where they're at is that you don't actually have this experience with smart kids who think they always know everything and all everything's always super easy for them. Because pretty quickly, even the smartest kid will reach a point if you're actually teaching them where they're at, where they're thinking, this is genuinely hard. I'm struggling with this. This is what it feels like to struggle. This is what it feels like to work on something. This is what it feels like to work through something. And if you are keeping people constantly in this zone of proximal development, if you are keeping people constantly in the place of things that they can't quite accomplish alone, but can accomplish with help, providing them that help, providing them that instruction, providing them sensible instruction with that, then they, I think, avoid a lot of these psychologically unhealthy modes, these modes of constantly being the smartest kid in the room syndrome, the lazy genius syndrome, things like that, right? These colloquial ideas, you can really set them in a place where they're suddenly around peers who are smarter than they are, who are more motivated than they are, who are further along than they are, and who are showing them just what is possible. And that creates, I think, a much healthier environment than having them coast through and think, I'm so smart, look at me, I can do everything without putting in the slightest bit of effort. Isn't that awesome? And that's one of the goals for that sort of thing.
So like I said, I think for a lot of people, this is going to be very popular.
Yes, yes.
Certainly the idea of like removing classes, as you said, it tests really, really horribly. It polls horribly. And people come out to vote against that if they're asked to. And so I think this is going to have some success. I think it's promising to see what's happened with phonics, where phonics seems to be having a revival, and that seems to be like a very evidence tested. Like this is the best way to get kids to read. So like forget everything else. Let's just teach them phonics, regardless of whatever the National Education Union or the teachers group or whatever says. But you are going to face some pushback because that's the nature of politics. Whenever you try to change gigantic systems, there's always going to be people who are suspicious of you and who are going to push back. And I think this is a great idea. But, there are people who are going to say, well, look, Jack is just part of this group that is the neoliberal agenda. And then they always call you a neoliberal. Trust me, like I'm well aware of that. So but Jack is just pushing this agenda. He just wants to get rid of diversity and equity and inclusion and the dreaded DEI. But there will be people who defend DEI and they'll say like, you just hate diversity. You hate equity and you don't want us to be included. And this is all a shadowy movement that says it's about excellence, but it's actually just trying to get rid of all the stuff, all that other stuff. And so with all that said, knowing that this is coming, and if you are to succeed, this is something you will have to deal with. I wonder where you draw the line on things like DEI, because to my mind, there's like obviously good forms of DEI. There's, like recognizing the achievement of Martin Luther King and making sure that students learn about that in US history classes. There's correcting the actual wrongs that were done, in the 60s and the 70s. Like I think it would be very silly to say, well, desegregating the schools is DEI in a sense that is bad. Like, we can argue whether or not we've done enough to address that historical wrong or not. But if desegregation is DEI, then that DEI is good. But there's obviously other forms of DEI that seem much sillier than that, I'll say. Harmful, maybe. And I'm sure you could provide several instances of that if you wanted to, but do you kind of have a stance on how far should equity go when it comes to closing gaps? We talked about the concept of closing gaps before. But maybe like when it comes to places in selective high schools, should there be any equity considerations for that? When it comes to college admissions, should there be any diversity considerations for that? Could it be, we just select the top 500 test scores and that's it? How do you think about that? Like, because, this is something that, look, if you're not successful, you'll never have to think about this. But if you are successful, you're going to have to think at some point about like what forms of DEI are good and which ones are bad.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I get really heated about this in a lot of directions. Heated at the failures of a lot of the culture warriors on the right to, keep the focus on the things that really matter, and heated at the failures of this whole apparatus of the left uh, to push forward functional ideas. But anyway, so I get heated at a lot of things. But one of the things I get most heated about, to start with this question of equity, is the question of elite college admissions. That, what should elite college admissions look like? In that, I think that there is this warping effect that this whole admissions system has on the lives of so many kids, where they are organizing their whole teenage years around, I want to target exactly the whims of this admissions department. Do I have the right mix of innate traits for this? Do I have the right charity for this? Have I polished my essay just right? Have I told my life stories and my hardships in just the right way? Have I, sung to them precisely the right song that they want to hear, so that I can get this golden ticket to an elite institution? And that these elite institutions that, as I like to say, fancy themselves the elites of egalitarianism. Places like Harvard that, on the one hand, they want to be absolutely sure that everyone knows they are the elite and they are crafting the elite class and they are doing that sort of thing. And on the other hand, they want people to know that they're on the forefront of egalitarianism and on the forefront of social change and on the forefront of pushing forward, decency and inclusivity and all of that. I would prefer schools like Harvard if they just straight up said, we're better than you, proles, suck it, like we are elite, whatever.
This is a
like,
proposal
like,
I've had
you know,
before. I've had a like maybe more people would appreciate Harvard if they just said like we are Harvard and we just want the smartest black kids in America. Like we're going to take the 50 smartest black kids every year, and that's just how we want it to be because we're Harvard. And I don't know if that would be more honest as opposed to what they've done in the past, where there's this like shadowy system where you get points for certain characteristics and like, I don't know, but
Yeah.
if they said that, I feel like it would at least be refreshingly honest. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it would. I think that right now we have this all this double talk around it, and a double talk that really controls people's lives. So in that sort of environment, like I don't like elite schools at all. I don't like the whole college admission system. I don't like any of that. And if I had my way, like the big thing to do is just like decrease the prestige and decrease the power of a lot of these elite institutions. I came up through public schools. I came up through the military, invested in the military, online schools, all of that. And now I'm at public law school, so forth. I really don't have much taste for any of this sort of elitism, but it if they were honest about it, it would be a little bit better, right? But what I do have what I do have a taste for is academic rigor and seriousness. A place like MIT or a place like Caltech that really, it doesn't feel like it feels like a reward in a sense to go to MIT, but it doesn't feel like a reward in a sense of, oh, everyone would love so much to go to MIT the way everyone loves to go to Harvard with its 98% graduation rates and everything and golden tickets to life. MIT is, yeah, you want to come here and you want to do really rigorous work and you want to, grind in a lab your whole life. Fantastic. We're glad someone does that. But most people look at that and be like, I don't really actually want to do that. And so I have a lot of respect for places like MIT and Caltech and such. And I think that places like that, yes, you just want to have test score admissions. You want to have like as rigorous criteria as possible. Places like Harvard, I just really want the admissions process to dominate people's lives less. I think that test-based admissions is helpful for it dominating people's lives less, but I don't think that's a perfect solution. I think expanding the size of these schools and opening them to more people is part of it. I think building more. So when you have, say, like selective high schools and stuff, I would really love to see a program of, in some of these states that don't necessarily have strong ideological opposition, but just haven't really thought about it. Like, why does Utah, for example, not have any selective public high schools the way New York does, the way San Francisco does, the way Philadelphia does? Like, why are we having fights over admissions criteria for some of these like selective schools? If people are saying that these selective schools are good, why aren't we trying to build more in Utah and Colorado and some of these states that just don't have any? And I think the answer is nobody's been thinking about it. Nobody's been talking about it. In terms of the broader fight over DEI, things like that, look, I want things to work. If like schools could have hard quotas on race and then select academically within those hard quotas, and obviously that's blatantly illegal and no one would accept it, but like I'd be satisfied with that. I'd be fine with that.
One of the proposals from actually one of my PPI colleagues named Richard Collenberg, he wrote a book called Class Matters. I think he was actually one of the expert witnesses on one of these like discrimination cases, like either the Harvard lawsuit or like North Carolina maybe had a lawsuit. But his theory is that, actually like people being raised in disadvantaged environments is a real thing, and you should account for that. Test scores are not neutral in the sense that like one person's 1,400 on the SAT might be more impressive than a 1,500 from a different kid, depending on how they grew up. But he says, but this should be based on class, not based on race or other, immutable characteristics. It should be based on, class and the neighborhood you grew up on. And there shouldn't be racial quotas or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe that's one kind of way we can square the circle on this kind of conversation.
And I can respect that sort of thing. I really think as long as admissions rather than the attainment of excellence is a prize, we are failing. So I think that as long as we are like trying to figure out how can we like cut the right level of disadvantage to give these admissions to these golden institutions and everything, like we're failing as long as admissions is the prize. And I'm not going to reach a level where I'm like, yeah, we have reached exactly the right level of admissions of people into these like anointed institutions, so forth. I really think that the goal is attainment of excellence. Institutions are a means to that end. As long as we keep our eyes on a prize of like admissions to these institutions as the highest good, we're going to fail. And so a lot of these systems that look to improve that, there's merit to them. I'm not saying they're meritless, everything. I am saying I'm a little bit cynical about that whole approach. Yeah. So one other example of like the sort of thing that I think is a huge missed opportunity that I want to shake some of these like anti-DEI quote unquote people for doing is like just these people who lean into the culture war and say this superficial like past few years have had this America's cultural revolution, things like that, whatever. And so we are going to be the anointers of this old culture and bring this stuff back with, say, University of Austin, for example, and then become like the anti-woke university, the culture war university, whatever, things like that. I think that is such a missed opportunity. And if I had that funding, if I had that institution, what I would do is not like build the anti-woke university, that's this new hub of culture, whatever. Education schools in the United States right now, almost anyone outside education schools will look at them and say, these schools aren't very good. They have not just this ideological capture, which is extraordinary throughout them. Like there's just this extraordinary level of like poor scholarship group think ideological capture, but they're captured by fads. They don't really focus very much on the actual science of learning. They have just deep running structural problems. They've been caught between these being as vocational schools and wanting to be more academic. A lot of just really bad ideas in culture come from education schools. And what I would do if I was like in a place like that, trying to create this countercultural thing is just say, we want to create a really, really good school of education. We want to create a really serious school of education. We see an area where these universities just aren't quite cutting it with what they're doing, and we are going to attract as many really serious people as we can find, as many effective, thoughtful, rigorous people who care passionately about the subject and have good ideas in it, and we are going to build a better school of education than these other schools have. And if they could build a better school of education than these other schools have, that's not going to be culture war university. That's going to be just general purpose useful. That's going to be an interesting, useful, meaningful institution that is worth the blood, sweat, and tears it takes to build an institution. And so I think a lot of people focusing on this like superficial stuff rather than really trying to tackle deeper running structural problems of why are institutions failing, where are they failing, and how can we build better ones, are taking a lot of understandable frustration and understandable energy and just channeling it towards flashy but ultimately unsatisfying things.
Look, if you want to take pot shots at the University of Austin, this is a safe space to do that. Like, so by all means.
I will take so many pot shots at it.
But we are coming up on time. So I want to ask the traditional final question that we often ask on this podcast, and that is, where do people go to learn more? And I will point everyone to your Substack in particular, um, which is, I believe the URL is just educationprogress.org. That's where you can find the Center for Educational Progress right now. I know you also have a personal Substack, but like beyond your own Substack, which if you're interested in listening to this, you should absolutely go check out Jack's Substack and the CEP Substack. But what else would you recommend for people who want to dive more into this, who are interested in the ideas that we're talking about, whether it's tracking, whether it's the history of education policy? What would you recommend for those people?
Yeah, great question. So one thing, I have actually compiled a list of recommendations on if someone wants to get up to speed on the things I care about in education. The CEP's education reading list compiles a lot of these resources, and it looks at what does the science of learning say, what is the science of expertise look like, what is the history of tracking and ability grouping in some of these policy fights, things like that. And we have recommendations for that sort of thing in our reading list there. So I won't repeat all of those recommendations here other than to say that that reading list is a useful place. In terms of like people doing really interesting things other than us, I think there are a lot of people who have fantastic ideas around the corners of the space. I would say like Grow SF has been achieving a lot of policy success in this space. They're worth keeping an eye out for. Then Math Academy is doing really interesting things in mathematics instruction. Telra Institute and Alpha School are two schools worth keeping an eye on in terms of innovative, thoughtful uses of tracking in education or uses of tailored education. And Art of Problem Solving, I always shout out as just being the gold standard for mathematics curriculum. Like that, every school doesn't know what art of problem solving is and isn't using it for their best students is a travesty. And that's the lowest hanging fruit out there. People like Karen Vates do fantastic work on tracking like early literacy stuff, things like phonics, Southern Surge. Zach Groeschel is a fantastic and thoughtful educator who has been focused on direct instruction, something we didn't touch on much here, but is crucial to understanding the picture. And yeah, I would say that people like that and institutions like that are the ones in the cluster that are worth paying attention to and worth understanding.
Well, we will include a link to that education reading list in the show notes. But I want to say thank you one more time to my guest, Jack Despain Zhou. Thank you for coming on the show.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.